David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I join with others in thanking the government for opening up this opportunity to discuss this very important issue. We do face an uncertain world, and the brutality and the atrocities of ISIS is part of that, but obviously not the only issue. And there are threats to New Zealand, and we have to acknowledge that. And we have said, as Annette King has said before, that we will adopt a bipartisan approach to strengthening, where necessary, New Zealand's security and intelligence services. And we appreciate the opportunity to be briefed on those. But we'll also reserve our final comment until we actually see that legislation before us. Where there are gaps, obviously we need to plug them, but we also need to be vigilant, because this is ultimately about balancing of our security with our human rights. So Select Committee, as we've insisted upon, is a critical issue. The option of urgency is not acceptable, and it's also I'm also pleased to see the sunset clause, which means that this legislation will ultimately fade out as the review of the legislation goes ahead. Sir, I want to make the point that we have to be very, very careful here that we don't overstate the issue of the threat that's before us. We've just heard Jerry Brownlee talk about this as being the worst terrorist organisation in history. John Key said last week that ISIS will rain carnage on the world. And make no mistake, it is a nasty, it's a brutish organisation that violates human rights in an awful way. But is ISIS about to bring mayhem and terror into our neighbourhoods? And the answer is no. They are brutal. They do commit atrocities. And they use those as a weapon to dominate two countries, Syria and Iraq. And it is sophisticated in the way that it uses local people to take up arms. And we need to be very careful about what we do to our local Muslim population, who are productive and peace-loving parts of our community, and in some ways radicalising those people in ways that we don't know how they could be radicalised by the actions we take. And I'm mindful of a study by the Royal United Services Institute in the UK, who was looking at the UK's role in the Iraq War. And it said that role increased the radicalisation of young Muslims. It said, far from reducing international terrorism, the 2003 invasion had the effect of promoting it. So if the cause is right, then we accept whatever risk we take. But we should understand that whatever we get into will affect the security of us back here in New Zealand. The Prime Minister also argues that this is an international, a regional and a local problem. I don't agree. This is a conflict that should be contained locally and regionally. It's actually us who is internationalising it by our presence in that local and regional area. And if we contrast the IS or Islamic State to Al-Qaeda, for example, Al-Qaeda actually started the other way. It internationalised a Muslim or Islamic issue rather than doing it locally. And then arguably, in 2001, posed a much greater risk than the Islamic State does today. They are not threatening the world. And again, I'm mindful, looking back in history to 2002, when Tony Blair said, and his cabinet, that Iraq posed an imminent threat to Britain. That's fairly laughable today, but it was the rhetoric at the time that was used to justify the Iraq war. And we should take real care that we do not exaggerate the threat of ISIS to justify the action that we are taking in New Zealand. Let's look at the broader contribution, sir, to Iraq. On the issue of Iraq, we are driven, or this government appears to be driven by the desire to do something alongside our Five Eyes partners. The rhetoric has been somewhat dialed back immediately after the election, when John Key was talking about deploying the SAS. So New Zealand's possible military contribution, as announced, is a sort of a balance between doing something to be there, but on the other hand, not upsetting the New Zealand public. The Prime Minister's probably looked at some of the polling data that's been coming through, because if he did, he would realise that New Zealanders are actually sending our young people off to war where there is little understanding of what they're there to do, or what they're there to achieve, as folly. And they might be right to ask those questions and have those doubts about what the reasons would be. Because if you look at what military analysts are saying about the current tactic of airstrikes, they're saying that those won't work without boots on the ground. We should remember actually that the forerunner of ISIS was actually what we called Al-Qaeda Iraq. Al-Qaeda Iraq was actually defeated by a surge, the surge as it was called, of tens of thousands of American soldiers alongside the arming of local Iraqi tribesmen. The same sort of tribesmen that fought valiantly but were defeated and then brutally murdered just this week by ISIS when they were trying to stand up for their freedoms but were not given the weaponry and the support that they needed. And that points to the problems within Iraq rather than the problems of outsiders trying to do the job. If we're going to go into Iraq, then we need to make a contribution, and a sensible one. We appear today to be more emphasising on a military solution. There was talk about sending 9 people into Iraq. We already know that 3 have gone. So we've made this decision, despite the fact that we have made no decisions. We've made this decision already in terms of what we're sending off to Baghdad. And I can be pretty emphatic that those people coming back won't be saying there is nothing for us to do there. They will be coming back with a job for the military. And we have to balance that off with the risk that we face by becoming involved in even the most benign form of contribution militarily, that we slide then further into additional deployments, that we up the risk of our own insecurity. But most of all, we have to be looking at what we will achieve. And I don't believe that the contribution of some military trainers, frankly, will achieve very much. Let's remember that the US spent 10 years in Iraq and spent billions of dollars training an entire Iraqi army, only to have them collapse in the first assault that they faced. This is not something that we are going to, I believe, contribute meaningfully in and around. Prime Minister, part of the problem there was that the army itself wasn't the problem. It was the way that Prime Minister Maliki at the time favoured his Shia group and in a sense undermined the very confidence that the Sunnis had in the work of the Shias. And that was commented on today by the Prime Minister in passing in the terms of the diplomatic role that we can play, and I believe a much more positive role in strengthening the government, the judiciary, the political framework that is operating in Iraq. We should seek a Security Council resolution for a mandate to have forces on the ground. And we should be able to up our humanitarian contribution from the $1 million announcement today. We should be focusing on those areas of ISIS where there is vulnerability. They are paying thousands and thousands of military and administrators at the moment. They need money. They need oil revenues. We should be shutting off those possibilities of that revenue, oil coming out and arms shipments going in. And we should be looking, sir, at the difference we can make to Iraq. New Zealand has never hesitated to go into conflicts where we believe the cause was right, where we were standing up for human rights or humanitarian law. Afghanistan and Timor-Leste being the 2 most recent. But we have to question the contribution that we make and whether that might be effective. The consequences that might flow from our actions that we can't see or perceive today. Sir, we need to be operating under a clear mandate, and our position on the Security Council and the confidence that the world has shown in us in voting us on give us ample opportunity to be able to do that. Thank you, sir.